Hello and welcome to another opening explorations video. And so I had some positive feedback by viewers on the previous opening explorations video, and especially the Caro-Kann. Viewer requested that I do more videos on the Caro-Kann. So I will do that. And just remember, if there's anything you would like to see as well, just leave comments and I'll try and do an overview of that opening. Let's take a look here. I will do some multiple videos on the Caro-Kann, so today I'll just focus on the advanced variation, which is what we have here on the board. Now, how did we arrive at this advanced variation? For the beginners out there, we'll show you. So E4 is played by white and then C6. So we have the Caro-Kann defense with this C6 move. And the reason this C6 move is played is to not directly, not immediately confront the center, but to fortify a D5 pawn push, which will counterattack the center. So white normally plays D4. Now there are other possibilities which I'll get into in future videos, but for this advanced variation, after D4, white takes control of the center with both of these pawns, so black strikes back, gaining an equal share in the center with D4, D5, and the C pawn backs up this pawn push, so that if white captured, black could recapture with the pawn. But in the advanced variation, white plays E5. So there you have it, the advanced variation. Now, there are different ways to play against this. For black, it looks like bishop to F5 is the most commonly played move by quite a bit. 26,000 times this was played. Versus the second move, which is C5, pushing the C pawn up, and that was only played 6,800 times. So first we'll take a look at bishop to F5, the most commonly played move. So here, what does white usually respond with? Well, it looks like most common is knight to F3. So just developing a piece, and this knight could possibly attack the bishop in the future by moving to the edge of the board. But let's see what black does in response. Usually E6 is played. So what has black achieved here? Well, a lot of times in this Caro-Kann, or it's almost like a French defense structure, this bishop can be trapped back here behind this pawn. So in the advanced variation, a lot of times when white pushes to E5, this pawn will move to E6, and the bishop could have been blocked in there behind this pawn. So the most common thing to do is move the bishop outside of this pawn chain, this bad bishop, which is blocked by pawns on the same color that this bishop travels on. So E6 is now played. The bishop is outside the pawn chain. And what are white's options here? Well, it looks like by far bishop to E2 is played. So right now, we'll just take a look at the most commonly played moves before I look at other less common variations. So bishop to E2 is played most often. What does this move do? Well, it allows white to castle kingside. White did not play bishop to D3 because then that would allow an exchange of this bad bishop for white's good bishop, which is on the opposite colored squares as his central pawns. So usually it's a good idea to exchange the bad bishop for the good one if you can, to get rid of this bishop that's kind of restricted in movement because of this pawn chain being on the same color as this bishop. So after this. Oh, and also, in the future, if this bishop wanted to move here and pin the knight to the queen, now that's not possible because of the bishop being here. So knight to d7 is the most common move. It looks like 3,725 times that was played versus almost 2,700 times by the second move, which is c5. So we see that c5 move being a common theme here, where when you have a pawn chain, usually the best place to break down that pawn chain is to attack the base of the pawn chain, which at the moment, that's d4. Although if c5 attacks it, the pawn could move here to c3 and protect it. All right, looking at the most commonly played move, which is knight to d7. What does that do? Well, maybe it moves a piece off the queen side. Then if the queen decides to move, well, black could castle over here on the queen side if he prefers that. Also, the knight covers the center a little bit, for this c5 pawn push. Also, if f6 is played to attack the top of the pawn chain, which is the second area that you can attack if you do not go after the base of the chain. Well, then in the future, maybe f6 could be played. And if that's captured, this knight could develop and be backed up by the other knight. Or this knight on d7 could even jump in there. All right, so now most common, by far, 3,500 moves versus only 99 for the second most played move, which is knight at b to d2. So the most common move is to just castle by white. Then we would have knight to e7, the most common move. Also h6 is possible, leaving an escape hatch for this bishop. If the knight jumps up here in the future and tries to attack this bishop, of course that's not possible at the moment because the queen could snatch that piece up. So most commonly played is that, knight to e7, developing the other knight. And now, also, see, now the knight could play an attack on the bishop. And I guess the bishop could retreat back, and then either, if the knight captures the bishop on g6, the pawn could capture, opening a file towards white's king side, or the knight could just recapture, so the pawns aren't doubled here. But most commonly played for white is knight at b to d7, and then h6. It looks like, leaving that escape hatch open for the bishop's retreat. And then knight to b3. So what does that move do? A piece has been moved twice in the opening. Normally you don't want to do that. But this move covers c5 here, so that if the c pawn is pushed, and the knight captures, this knight will basically discourage this pawn push, because now the knight is covering that and could just recapture. So now black's most played response is g5, threatening to attack the knight. And then we have a knight retreat to e1, queen to c7. Just developing, getting ready to possibly castle queenside. And now knight to d3. So we see there's a fight to prevent this c5 pawn push. So a common theme in the game here. Now, I'll play this out a little bit further so you can see how the pieces develop. But one of the markers that you can basically decide if your opening worked well for you or not is what happens with the rooks. So if in your opening and going into the middle game, your rooks end up in good positions and are activated. That usually means that you played a little bit better in that opening. The opening was somewhat successful, depending on what else is happening in the opening. But that is a good marker to tell if your openings are working or not, if your rooks end up being activated. So let's play this out a little bit further. Most played move is knight to g6, then bishop to e3. So both sides continue developing here. Now castling. So black has activated his queenside rook, which wasn't doing much here. Now it's in towards the center, and you usually want your rooks on open or half open files, but if that's not available to you, then the next best thing is to have your rooks in a location where the pawns have been pushed forward. That way, the rooks can back up those forward pawns, and the pawns that have been pushed forward might be more likely to be traded off, opening up lines for your rooks. So now we have what? Bishop to g4, and we're getting down to the end where there's only like a few games that show the most common moves. So here it's a tie, either bishop to g4 attacking this bishop, or a4. So looks like white won a little bit more with this move. So now we have what? Either capture or bishop to e4. So I don't know. I don't think I'm going to go too much further because there's some other lines that I would like to look at. But we see what's happening here. Black has to develop this bishop and then figure out what to do with his rooks. He could start pushing forward here on the king side because it's an opposite side castling game. So both sides can start storming their pawns forward, funneling pieces in behind the pawns, and start attacking. All right, let's go back here. We'll go back to the beginning. So we looked at e4, c6, d4, d5, the common moves played in the Caro-Kann, or the most common moves. So, well, let's take a look and see. We'll go back to the beginning real quick. So after e4, how often is the Caro-Kann played? It looks like it's the fourth most played opening behind the Sicilian defense, e4, e5, and then e4, e6, the French defense. So e4, c6, the Caro-Kann, and now by far 112,000 almost to 12,000 for the second, and 7,800 for the third most played moves, which I'll do future videos on these less common moves. But the most commonly played is d4, then d5 by far is played most often, and then the advanced variation, which is e5. So second most common is knight to c3. So back to the advanced variation. So we looked at this e5 move, and then most commonly played was bishop to f5. So we'll take a look at another way this bishop to f5 variation could play out. So we looked at the most common move, knight to f3. Well, what about the second most common move, h4 here? Now, why is this the second most common move? Well, if we have e6 being played like this, well, now g4 could be played. That's played most often. And then e4, f3, and then what? The bishop is trapped. So the most commonly played move now is bishop to e7, and then this bishop can be captured. So bishop to e7, capture, capture with check. So, an interesting variation here where now the king is under attack and being checked. The center is closed, so it's not as dangerous, of course, as if the center was open. But usually the king moves here, and then we have a capture. Knight to c3 is played, at least in the example game that we had here. And then what? h5. And in this variation, black went on to win. So, this is one crazy way the game could go. But, I'll play this out a little bit further. It looks like in the game, black tried to open things up even more. White grabs this material. Now we have a pawn being captured and the rook is activated here. So now, knight to d6 check, king over to f8. What next? Bishop to e3 and knight to h6 here. So interesting stuff. Knight takes b7. This looks like just a wild and crazy game. And so it all started with this bishop to f5 move and then the h4 move here. So you have to watch out, that your bishop could get trapped. So it looks like the most common response is this, h5, keeping space equal in the king side, and then, giving room for this bishop to retreat. So now, looks like most commonly played is either c4, but number one is bishop to d3. And then usually we have a capture, queen recaptures, then e6, and we'll play this out a little bit further. Bishop to g5 attacking the queen. Queen counterattacks this unprotected pawn. Now what? Knight to d2 is played most often. Interesting. So here you don't want to capture this pawn, it looks like. So let's see. We could take a quick look at that. I mean, what happens if you go there? Well, then you have rook to b1, and you'll be able to counterattack, grabbing this pawn up here, and black will not be able to castle queenside, or it'll be much less likely to castle queenside in the future. Here, queen to a3. I'm wondering why they didn't just snatch up another pawn here. I guess we could take a look at that, because in this variation, white could capture and then pick off this pawn up here. So, what happens if you go here? There are no games that show that variation. So, still, in this variation, could snatch this b pawn up. All right, I don't want to dig too deep into some specific single variation, because there's a lot more to take a look at here. So here we saw h4, h5, then bishop to d3 is played most often, capture, queen captures, e6, and then bishop to g5, attacking the queen, queen to b6, and then what did we look at? Knight to d2, and now it's showing c5 was most common. So once again, here you go, this common theme of attacking the base of the pawn chain, and the most often played move, you think c3 might be a common move, but looks like that's only played 7 times. By far, c4 is usually played. So then queen captures. Rook to d1 is usually played. And now knight to c6, knight to e2, and knight to b4, forking the queen and the pawn here. So looks like queen to f3 is most common. And then we have a check. King has to move and is prevented from castling. Knight captures. Knight captures. Anyway, then the queen, and white most often plays queen to b3 next. So interesting. Bishop to e7. Capture, capture, queen captures, and rook to d8. So another kind of wild possibility in the Caro-Kann advance. So let's go back. I'll go back to the beginning, the very beginning. That way we can take a quick review or a recap. So e4, c6, d4, d5, and the advanced variation. All right, so this is the most commonly played move, bishop to f5. And we looked at knight to f3 and the possible h4 move. After that, there's knight to c3, knight to d2. What's the difference between c3 and d2? Well, knight to c3, the knight is a little more forwardly placed, and maybe a little bit more active, but it's blocking in the c pawn. So sometimes knight to d2 is played. That way the c pawn can move up, possibly either attack d5 or fortify the d4 pawn. All right, let's see here. So we looked at knight to f3. So let's take I guess we could take a quick look at that and see if there are any other branches that were interesting. So normally e6 is played here, then bishop to e2, knight to d7. So I went over this earlier, castling, and knight to e7. So the other option is just h6 immediately, leaving an escape hatch for the bishop. All right, I think I will go back to the beginning of the advanced variation, and we'll just look at another possibility instead of bishop to f5. So the number 2 move is c5. So this is the variation that I'm currently learning and trying to play in my Quest for 2000 series, which you can watch on my channel. So I've only been playing it maybe for a month or so. So I'm still trying to learn it and get this variation down. But let's look at the most commonly played moves. D takes c5 is the number 1 played move. So normally we have a capture here. And now it looks like number 1 is e6. So after this move, the bishop is unleashed, attacking this pawn. Well, now it looks like most common is just a3, and then the bishop will capture here. So we'll have to take a look at maybe b4 to see what happens if they hold on to this pawn. But these are the most commonly played moves. We have b4, attacking this bishop now. The bishop retreats back either to e7 or most common is bishop to b6, controlling this diagonal, aiming at the weak f2 pawn, which is only protected by the king. So now most common is knight to f3. So developing a knight, protecting this pawn, maybe preventing a queen threat of moving down here and putting more pressure on the f pawn. Let's see. Next, most played by black is knight to e7. So developing the knight, preparing a possible kingside castling, and this knight could move to g6 here, piling up pressure on this e pawn, along with a knight to c6. So let's see how it normally plays out. Looks like now most commonly played is bishop to d3. Now white's ready to castle. Then knight adding pressure to this pawn, or I guess starting the pressure with this knight moving to g6, as right now nothing else is attacking. So castle is played most often. And then knight to c6. So now we're adding pressure with two knights attacking. And normally the bishop develops, helping protect that pawn. Castling by black. Rook to e1, helping fortify the pawn. Moving the rook on a not an open file yet, but as I mentioned earlier, to tell if your opening is working out okay, one way that can be determined is if your rooks end up developed and on decent squares. And if you don't have a half open file or an open file to put the rook on, then the next best thing is to place them behind pawns that you have pushed forward or are planning to push forward. So now we have f6 as the most often played move, and then capture towards the center instead of developing the queen. So this does leave black with a pretty strong pawn formation here. So white immediately attacks that pawn formation, and now we have knight to f4, guarding the pawn and attacking the bishop. Bishop retreat, e5. Interesting. And you would think that maybe they would play the capture of that c pawn, but if we play the most common move, e5, well then it looks like white wins most often there. So apparently it might be safer to play this capture of the pawn. Then the bishop usually captures, putting pressure on this pawn, which is pinned to the king. And then capture, capture, king up to g7, and knight to c3, e5, and knight up to d5. So here you have it. Now I'll play a few more moves out. The game kind of went in this direction. Now, let's see. Rook to d8 or bishop to g4. So, maybe we take the bishop to g4 move, pinning the knight to the rook. So then b5, an attack on this knight. Knight to d4, knight captures, bishop captures, rook up to d2, and then we just have some material being traded here. Rook at a to b8, guarding this pawn, and b6, locking this pawn on the same colored square as the bishop. So capture, rook captures, bishop up to c8 to guard this pawn, and rook at a to b1, piling the pressure on. And here we have a possibility of, attacking the bishop and retreat to protect. Rook to a8, but you get the idea. We see that black's rooks are a little more passive here. Well, this one guarding the pawn, this one is active, attacking. Now rook to a8, bishop captures, rook captures, capture, capture, and anyway, this is how the game could progress into the end game. We have the rooks doubled up here. Black has rooks that are pretty open as well. This white could take the 7th rank possibly, and white has to watch out for any back rank surprises. But the game looks like it went on to a draw. All right, let's go back here. So we looked at the advanced variation and then this c5 move. So, where did we go from here? So D takes c5, the most common move. So after that, looks like e6 is what we checked out. Now, in the game, or the variation that we just looked at, a3 was played. But what if they try and hold on to the pawn with this move? Well, then it looks like a5 is the best way to go. Then c3 to protect. And now capture, capture, b6, and bishop to e3. So fortifying here. Capture and capture. So bishop takes c5, bishop takes, and then we have this check. So knight up to d2, queen recovers the lost bishop, and now rook to c1, attacking the queen. Interesting. Queen to d4, rook captures, king moves up to d7, queen to c1, and it's not looking so good here for black. Queen takes e5, guarding this checking square here, and the knight is guarding this square. Bishop to e2, and white is under check, so blocks with the bishop. Now rook captures, knight to f3, attacking the queen, rook to a1, counter-attacking white's queen. So this is an interesting variation. And then we have check. And it looks like black probably resigned here after that mistake. So just an interesting game there. And a lot of times people think the Caro-Kann is quiet and not much. It's more of a strategic, solid defense. But you have to watch out because sometimes the games can take a crazy turn like this game did here. So I don't know. Let's take another look at how things could have gone differently here, or what maybe we should have played. So e4, e5 is played, and now in the game we just looked at this c5 move, capture, e6. The bishop is attacking, and we played this a5, or excuse me, b4 to cover this c pawn. And then a5 was played. So a5, and then c3. So now we have a capture. All right, capture. b6. And let me turn on the analysis engine real quick. Let's see where we're at here. It looks like in this position, the recommendation is just knight to f3. So what did we have? We had this bishop to e3 move. So let's take a look at that. If that is played, looks like best is to capture. Then capture with the bishop or the pawn. So in the game, we looked at capturing with the pawn. And then, what went wrong here? We looked at this move. All right, and so that must be the mistake right there. So apparently that is the mistake. Capture, and then if you have this check, knight to d2 blocks, and now capture. Yeah, the rook to c1 move is bad. So if we go back, looks like it's better just to develop. And that's where black went wrong. They didn't develop their pieces. Okay, let's get out of here, go back, and we'll look at some other possibilities. So e4, c6, d4, d5. The advanced variation with the e5 move, and we looked at c5. And then most common is to capture. I guess we should look at the second most common move, which is just to play knight to f3, developing. And then looks like knight to c6, adding more pressure. And now the recommendation is just to capture this pawn. So once again, we see the theme here of just putting pressure on each other with these two pawns on c5 and d4. So capture. What next? Now bishop to g4 is played most often. c3, preparing to push the other pawn and protect here. Now e6. Bishop to e3, protecting the pawn. Capture, capture. So here black loses the bishop pair, but it was a bad bishop that was restricted by all these pawns on the light squares. So it probably wasn't so bad giving up the bishop for that knight, and in a more closed position. But let's see how the game continued. Knight captures, bishop to b5 check, knight to c6 here. So blocking, and castling by white, knight to f6, now c4. Putting pressure on this. a6, most often played as a retreat, keeping the bishop pair. Queen to queen, not king, to a5, attacking the bishop. And then just develop another piece with a protection of this bishop. So now capture. Capture, capture, and the king is in the middle here. So knight, capture, capture. Black is kind of hanging out in the wind there. So another idea of how this game can quickly go into an end game. Oh, then we have that move, and white looks, black. Yeah, white looks like they have black in trouble again here, and white does go on to win. So king to e7, rook at f to e1 now, and Yeah, it looks like they probably resigned here. Their pawns look terrible. White's king is safe. Um, Black's king is just hanging out in the wind here. All right, well, we'll go back and see if there's anything else to take a look at before I wrap this up. I'm not going to go too crazy. I already showed a bunch of different lines. So let's see. We looked at, after e5, the most commonly played move, bishop to f5. Second most common is c5 here. Now, some other possibilities, g6, which kind of just lets white, do whatever they want, and it doesn't really pose too many immediate problems for white. Knight to a6, I don't know, that looks a little bit maybe dubious, because knight to a6, you could just capture and wreck their pawns over there. I guess we could take a quick look at that. But looks like most commonly played is just c3 here. So c3, then the knight jumps up to c7, bishop to d3. Now that g6 move is played. Knight to e2, bishop develops. So this is just another example of how things could play out. f6 attacking here, so capture, capture. h4, that's sometimes a good strategy when somebody is fianchettoed. Launch the h pawn and try and break open the fianchettoed position a little bit. Knight to e7, h5, bishop to f5 here. Knight to b3, king moves over, and what next? f3, b6, g4. Oh, excuse me, white's turn. Yeah, attacking the bishop. Then we have an exchange, and now queen develops, bishop develops, a5 in case white wants to castle queenside, which they do. And now a4, knight to a1, a3, b3. So c5. So we see here the pawns are storming forward towards white's position. But white did go on to win here after knight to c2, queen to b5, exchange here of the queens, and then capture, capture, h6. Interesting move here, pushing forward, really limiting this bishop. The bishop moves here, bishop up to e3, putting pressure on that pawn. So then we have c4, knight to d4, capture, capture, so an outpost for this knight on d4. And now we see white's rooks are a little more active. Black has this rook, but this one is just stuck in the corner, not doing much. So I would say that white came out a little bit ahead there. All right, back to the beginning. And feel free to leave comments if there's something specifically you would like to see in this opening, or one of any other opening. I can try and run through the variations and see hopefully some of the possibilities that you would be interested in. All right, so one more time: d4, d5, or excuse me, e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, the advanced variation, and knight to a6 here. So that, we just looked at that. Looks like bishop takes a6 has only been played 3 times. I guess because you're giving up your bishop pair, even though you are kind of breaking up their pawns over here. It's probably too early to be giving up the bishop pair. All right. Anything else? Probably the bishop to f5, the main line. This move. This is probably the most played and the most critical line that you should study. And then right after that is this c5 move. And then here, what if they just play this? Well, then looks like you just add more pressure, and it's almost like a French defense. After knight to f3, you pin the knight, the bishop breaks the pin, e6 is played, the bishop is outside the pawn chain, and it's almost like a French defense structure. So castle, bishop takes, and then finally a trade here in the center. The queen adds pressure. So we have most played is bishop to e3 to cover that, and then this pawn could fall. So bishop to e3, protecting the center. Queen grabs the unprotected pawn. Knight to d2. Queen retreats back. Rook attacks. And now queen over to c7. Queen to b3, adding more pressure. Rook to b8 protects the pawn. Rook at f to c1. And even though white is behind a pawn here, we see that they have put their rooks on good positions, a half open file and an open file. And here the game continued with knight at g to e7. Bishop moves back here, maybe heading towards the center. Let's see what happens. Queen to d7 gets off of the attack of this rook. Queen to a4, a6, so that pawn was being attacked. Rook to b2, maybe threatening to double rooks. Rook to a8, rook at c to b1, and rook to a7. Interesting choice. Queen drops back, knight up to c8, and knight to b3. All right, so b6, keeping that knight out. Rook to c1, putting pressure on this knight. So protect the knight, line up on the queen. Queen over to d3, attacking the unprotected pawn. And bishop to a3. All right, well, black ended up winning here, and this is probably part of the reason here. So the game continued with, oh man, knight to c5, really? Now why would you not? Oh, because now the bishop is under attack. Okay, so, interesting little maneuver there. Capture, b5. Now this pawn is a little weak and isolated. a4, attacking. Knight to a7. Bishop to f4, protecting this attacked pawn. And finally, black castles and activates his other rook. Queen over to g3, lining up on the king. Knight to e7, maybe getting ready to jump over here and block and attack the bishop and pawn. Bishop to d3, lining up on the king side. Rooks double, as do whites. And then rook to c6, preventing the pawn from pushing forward in the future. Rook to c3, where the rook can move along the third rank in the future and maybe push over here and line up on the king side. So bishop or excuse me, knight blocks attacking bishop and pawn, and so white just gets rid of that. And then an interesting capture in this direction, maybe so the rooks can line up here. Queen to h4, d4 attacking. Rook moves here, threatening to capture the pawn, so the pawn pushes forward. Queen to g3, g5, capture, capture, capture. Rook takes. All right, anyway, I'll end it there. Well, I guess we can go a little bit further, but it looks like the advantage is with black now. So what happened in the game? The bishop, or excuse me, the rook moves, and then queen to c7, tripling up here. Queen to h5, threatening an attack. It looks like the game ended here. I believe black ended up winning because black is just ahead in material here with that extra knight. All right, well, let's see. I think that's about it. We looked at this advanced variation with the most common move being bishop to f5. Second most common is c5. So those are like the two main things you want to look at. So after c5, most often they will just capture this pawn. So that's probably one of the things to look at the most here. And then knight to c6 could be played immediately. And then what? Most common is either knight to f3 or just pinning here. And now e6, bishop to e3, protecting the pawn. Knight to e7, c3, getting ready to protect here. Break the pin, capture, capture. Knight develops. Knight attacks the bishop. Bishop up to d4. Capture. Oh, and here, most common is queen captures. All right, so we move here. That allows protection of this pawn, but then b6 is usually played. Capture, capture, castle. And this will be the last line I'll look at. So, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Leave comments if you want to see any other specific lines that I can maybe work on in the future, or different openings. I'll do more of these Caro-Kann, different Caro-Kann variations, as it seems like people are pretty interested in those. So here black usually castles. Now the rooks are about to be developed. Knight to d4, going after the bishop pair, so the bishop retreats. f4, rook at f to c8, grabbing the half open file. a3, I guess just fortifying this pawn. And so this bishop is kind of trapped on guard duty here. Queen to c4, rook to f3, guarding the pawn. Rook to a4. Finally, this knight can move. Queen goes back. Now this one is under attack. So knight to b1, guarding both pawns. Queen back to c4. Knight to d2. Queen back to a6. Queen jump back here. And it looks like they're about to repeat the position. Why does it keep showing that? I think the position has been repeated here. It just keeps going back and forth. Maybe there's something wrong with the... All right. Yeah, it should have been a draw here. I don't know why this was not considered a draw, and it just keeps going on. All right. I don't know why they're showing this. Maybe it's some mistake. It's showing that black won, but if they would have went back and forth like that, that would have been a draw. All right, so just remember, if your opening is succeeding, then you'll probably have your rooks develop to good positions here, where blacks are a little bit more active in attacking, whites defending with this rook, and this rook is defending as well, but at least it's a little more active. So there you have it, the Caro-Kann advance variation, which is e4, c6, d4, d5, and e5. The most commonly played move is bishop to f5, so you'll have to know what to play against that, which, if they play f5 or bishop to f5, it looks like just most common is just developing the knight, although you can play h4 or develop your other knight. And if your opponent does not play the most common move, second most common is this. So you'll have to know what to play against this. It looks like most often white just captures. You could develop your knight, or maybe even play c3 here, going for kind of a French defense structure. There you have it, some examples of the Caro-Kann advance variation. If you enjoyed this, as I said, please like and subscribe, leave comments, and I will do some future videos with more Caro-Kann variations. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.